After 3 straight games set in the far future, all of which chose to do something other than the traditional boots-on-the-ground gameplay that Call of Duty had become known for, the series was ready for a reset. Considering the development cycles involved, it's clear that World War II wasn't a response to the vitriolic nonsense that had grown within the fanbase. Instead, it seemed the series had chosen to go back to its roots of its own volition, and this game was the result. As the name suggests, Call of Duty World War II takes place during World War I, give or take a few years and a new regime hellbent on genocide. In returning to World War II, this title saw fit to make a handful of changes to the core formula, some of which had been part of the series in one form or another before Modern Warfare caused the series to explode. One of these changes is the reliance on health packs and a static health bar that doesn't recharge over time. While one might see this as a massive change to the formula, because the world relied heavily on single-shot rifles at the time, it doesn't actually make the game feel that different from previous entries. Now you simply have to be a bit more aware of when your health is low and use a medkit to deal with the issue. Though it does create a bit of an annoyance if you end up running out of medkits and are low on health. If this happens, thanks to the weapons still being hit-scanned, you might as well just sort of give up, because it's unlikely that you'll get to a medkit before you get shot, particularly if Zussman isn't around. Zussman is one of many of your allies in World War II, and I would assume he's a field medic, considering he can offer you medkits on request as long as his meter is full. This is another one of the changes, since you actually have several allies that each have different abilities like this, from mortar strikes to pointing out enemy locations to offering things like ammo or grenades. Just like most of the recent games, and in particular Infinite Warfare, the emphasis here is once again on characters rather than events. And honestly, the characters are pretty interesting here as well. The relationships are a bit more traditional for a World War II story, meaning I can't say it was anything that left me in awe, but they were still solid, particularly considering conflict arises throughout thanks to the leader of the group, William Pearson, which brings a bit of depth to the relationships. Probably the standout for me was the interactions between Frank Aiello and another soldier, Marcus Howard. You see, Howard is an African-American soldier in World War II, and Frank is a bit of a racist. African-American soldiers weren't exactly well respected for their work at the time. Despite nearly 1 in 16 soldiers fighting for the United States being African-American, they were denied the ability to take certain roles in the war effort, and generally were forced into hard labor roles instead. What's more, they were all kept segregated until things got desperate near the end of the war, and once the fighting was over, the segregation continued as they helped during the occupation of Germany. Frank feels this kind of mindset is justified, and is disgusted to be expected to work alongside Howard. While this relationship isn't one that's extremely fleshed out, I like the flavor it brings in, particularly with the way it resolves near the end of the game. Similar to Ethan and Omar in Infinite Warfare, Frank grows to respect Howard for his hard work and dedication as the game wanes on. But in a bit of commentary I personally find to be rather biting, when Frank finally confronts Howard to apologize for his stupidity, Howard shakes his hand but sternly replies,
"You owe me a hell of a lot more than that."
I like this because it's not the regular Hollywood style, "Oh, you're done being a racist now? That's great" nonsense. Howard knows Aiello hasn't really changed, and he's not going to let him off that easy. There's more to repairing race relations than apologizing. For Howard, I don't think it's enough for Aiello to simply stop using hurtful language or treating African Americans like they're subhuman. Doubly so since the moral perspective of the Nazi Party wasn't really that different, and yet they stood universally opposed to it in that context. Howard understands that true change would come from Aiello finding the willingness to push others to treat African Americans with the same respect and dignity. It hints at just a bit of the depth and complexity of these sorts of issues, and makes clear that building brotherly bonds you've previously denounced is about a lot more than simply treating it like water under the bridge and pretending it never happened. One would hope that ILO did exactly this, despite the fact that ultimately, much of the contributions of African Americans in World War II were practically erased from history. So while I'm not enough of an authority to say that Call of Duty World War II does this idea justice, at the very least, I was both surprised and delighted to see it treated with a bit of tact, let alone highlighted at all. The game also touches briefly on a few of the other problems and horrors of the war, like concentration camps. It doesn't get too far into them, but it doesn't exactly shy away from them either. I feel it struck a nice middle ground overall. Okay, with some of the more heavy stuff out of the way, let's get back to the gameplay. Once again, World War II decides to bring back the contextual lean. It works fine here, but I don't think it's quite as smooth as the implementation in Infinite Warfare, since a lot of the cover you'll find yourself using isn't exactly square. The natural environments you'll regularly find yourself in means the lean is a bit finicky at times, so I ultimately didn't use it that often. Meanwhile, instead of the slide, we're once again back to the dive, which was previously seen all the way back in Black Ops 1 and Black Ops 2. And similar to those games, it's a fun move, but it's more dangerous than useful a lot of the time, limiting its practical use as well. One of the brand new mechanics is the focus gauge, which replaces the breath meter when using sniper rifles, but it can now also be used with normal weaponry, slowing down time for a brief few moments and allowing you to line up shots. I once again didn't use this that often, but it's more so because I kept forgetting about it. It was actually a pretty useful mechanic otherwise. As a way to give players a bit more control without it feeling like it stems from some sort of sci-fi time dilation belt or something, I think this works. It's basically just bullet time in the first person. Hardly new within first-person shooters, but I feel it's done particularly well here. Beyond this, the game also employs more complex QuickTime events and uses them fairly regularly, almost like it's a nod to Call of Duty 3. I didn't mind these, and most of them are probably not an accessibility issue either because of the way they function, which is nice. But I also don't feel they added too much to the game, and honestly probably won't even remember they exist in just a few weeks. Finally, one small thing I wish they'd have done more of is the ability to flip tables over and use them for cover. Granted, shoving random tables around the environment constantly would have been goofy and stupid, but it's yet another one of those tiny little additions that I feel adds some much appreciated flavor to the moment-to-moment action and is underutilized. Overall, in terms of gameplay, I feel they did what they could with what the history it's based on afforded them. I won't fault them for that, since it's much stronger than something like World at War is today, but it's still worth noting that it's ultimately pretty tame and standard compared to the last handful of games. Mechanically, it's probably the most solid of the completely boots-on-the-ground games up to this point. No issues with flinch, despite it being relatively high, because the modern enemy AI on regular and the single-shot weaponry levels things out. Explosives weren't an issue, nor was Last Stand, and I'm not even sure there are any moments where the enemies spawn infinitely until you move forward. The only mission I felt was a particular standout, though, was the spy/infiltration mission. It's once again one of those really strong moments the franchise occasionally stumbles upon, and is a mission I greatly respect for its freedom and pacing. It reminds me of the similar mission in Medal of Honor Frontline, but way better. None of the other missions were bad by any means. It was all really solid, but it wasn't always anything particularly revolutionary. My only real issue is honestly the fact that it once again shifts between 30 frames per second cutscenes and gameplay constantly, mid-mission. It feels jarring rather than organic, like it was intended to feel. Some people use the train part as an excuse to say the whole game is way too crazy for a World War II story, but it's really not. Most of the game is pretty tame, and honestly, I don't feel it's that big of a deal anyway. What does that one ridiculous scene ultimately affect in the plot? Nothing. It's not like the game has you jumping out of a plane to snipe Hitler while you're free-falling and then landing into Jeep to drive away into the sunset. You were obviously going to survive the train crash either way. That's how standard storytelling works, so why does it really matter if it's a bit bombastic or not? Overall, World War II was a solid entry in the series. It didn't blow me away, but I didn't really expect it to. Considering I had so few mechanical issues, I think it's worth respecting it for what it accomplishes. It's not the best game I've ever played, but it was a solid use of 5 or so hours.